cloud. All right. Good evening. Welcome, everyone. Happy New Year. This is Mark Pinto here at Phoenixville Public Library, and welcome to our first Zoom presentation of 2021 on a topic that we hope will generate some good discussion tonight. We're pleased to have with us Eric Krieg, who is a local electrical engineer, science promoter, and a former skeptic of global warming, who has been studying the science of global warming for decades. He's also a backpacker and a grandparent who cares about the long-term future of planet Earth. We know you all do too, and that's why you're here tonight. Thanks for joining us as we now welcome Eric. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you, Phoenixville Public Library, for giving people this forum to learn things. As Mark said, I'm a grandparent. There's two of my four grandchildren. I live in Lower Providence. I love nature. I love this area. I was running 6 miles this morning in Valley Forge National Park. I want to see things still be around for not just my kids' kids, but their kids too. When you put all this in context, it's not just our generation wrecking the earth, but in prehistory, the first people that came to North America made these and many other wonderful large megafauna go extinct. Of course, in Europe and Asia and everywhere humans have gone, they've left extinction, all kinds of desecration behind them. The reason why you can find all kinds of old cities is the pattern of history was to destroy all the topsoil, have nothing left to eat, and then move on to another place. It's kind of been humans' pattern for quite some time. And it's my hope in another century, we can have the first sustainable society that can just have a way to keep going on and on. When you get into the whole issue of global warming, underneath it all is energy. And on the right-hand side, we see where it goes to. It's only a little more than 10% goes to our houses. Most of it is commercial factories and transportation and big end stuff like that. You're turning off light bulbs. It's a great thing to do on principle, but it's certainly not going to turn things around. On the other side is where our energy comes from. It's only honest to say that solar, which so many people have hoped for, provides almost nothing now. This might be a little old. It could have doubled. Likewise, hydroelectric provides almost nothing, and the same with wind. But these two things are right now the cheapest, as of late, way to get new energy. So look for them to start ratcheting it up. Unfortunately, environmentalists who seem to be more anti-technology than pro-Earth kept us from having a lot more nuclear power, which is a separate issue. I happen to think it's much safer than these bad things. Natural gas isn't so bad. Coal is really bad, not just putting carbon in the atmosphere, but all kinds of poison, leaving mining tailings. It really is nasty stuff to have. And of course, petroleum is probably the next worst thing in terms of pollutants and disruption to the earth. Biomass is at least renewable because you can grow more of it, but it takes a lot of energy to make it, so that 4.5% really kind of covers up a lot of energy that it takes. But in the history of human advancement, we owe a lot of it to energy. Energy, getting it cheap out of the earth the way we've done, has been a boon to mankind and allowed us to have all the wonderful science and roads and civilization that we have now. Unfortunately, all this century of doing that left a lot of it up in the atmosphere. Now, a lot of people don't quite get the role of CO2 in the atmosphere. And it was really 100 years ago that this guy who understood thermodynamics, the rate of energy going from the sun to the earth, and the rate that energy should go from the earth out into space. And he calculated that it should really be a lot colder. He didn't know why Earth was as warm as it was. Later, people came to understand that greenhouse gases are what make the Earth as warm as it is. This is probably one of the most important images today. When you have heat energy radiating out from the sun coming towards us, most of it is in the visible spectrum. the same kind of light that you can see. So the clear atmosphere, it tends to go right through to. When it hits ground area, then it turns to heat. That's a different kind of energy than light energy. That heat, as it's radiated off from the Earth, tends to go up to where there might be greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and a percentage of it will go right on through, but some will bounce back. When you have light hitting ice-covered areas, most all the light energy bounces back, not much of it turns to heat. So what ends up happening is just a little bit more insulation in here in the form of methane, water vapor, certainly CO2 reflects enough heat back that for the last century has been slowly warming up the Earth. So the more CO2 that we have up there, the more it reflects back. It's a simple middle school experiment to get a block of dry ice, a light bulb in a box, and you'll see the temperature go up because CO2 reflects more energy back than that evaporates from the dry ice than normal air does. In the last couple of years, even skeptics of global warming have started to give it up. There's a lot of significant milestones that we've crossed recently. America had at one point 130 degrees this year. There's a time that there is 2 hurricanes on track to hit us at the same time. 16 of the last 19 years have been the hottest years ever. People can't deny that all kinds of glaciers that aren't gone already are on their way to going. It also is the first time that they recorded over 60 degrees in the Antarctic. And of course, 2020 will probably be calculated to be the hottest year ever. And we'd expect the same for 2021. When you look at global warming, the big debate is why have conservatives like me tended to be slow to accept it. Back when Al Gore first got on the bandwagon, my reaction as a Republican was this guy is just trying to pump this up to get political power. That kind of started me and many Republicans on a path of initially being skeptical of it. There also was people like the Koch brothers, not quite sure how it's pronounced. They were very much invested in big oil, and they spent tens of millions of dollars creating kind of phony science groups to essentially muddy the waters on global warming. This is the same kind of thing the cigarette lobby did to buy themselves about 20 years at a time before people really knew cigarettes caused cancer. Also, people that are conservative tend to not like the narrative, America's bad, what we're doing is hurting other countries. So our minds tend to get a little bit tired of that. So the global warming message that tends to blame America, it just doesn't sit well. And then, of course, older people that are naturally conservative, newer ideas take longer for them to accept. So that's simply been a problem and left America being more divided than most countries. Most countries are just far more liberal than America when it comes to accepting global warming. So then the question goes, okay, it exists, few people are bothering to even deny it anymore. How do we fix it? I don't know if this young girl, Greta, if her approach is the best one or not. I understand math better than people. But even if we stop getting rid of any new CO2 going in the atmosphere tomorrow, the Earth would still heat up. I just yesterday found out that this statement really is not altogether correct. This graph, which I just got in a dialogue with a Icelandic global warming person, is part of a report saying in about 10 years after stopping all emissions, you'd slowly at least have it start to cool. I haven't gone over all the mathematics of this. I'm still wrapping my head around it, but it's absolutely great if that's all it takes to get back. I had thought that the 1,500 gigatons of CO2 in the atmosphere, I was told it would just stay up there. I would have expected that to keep warming the Earth. Exactly how much and how fast the Earth is going to warm, Al Gore was definitely premature on saying it would become disastrous. So it really is hard to tell how bad it would get. We in America, in a temperate zone where it's cold, for many people that are thinking about moving to Florida, of course, it's not so bad. But the most highly populated part of our planet, lives where it's really hot. And it's really weird, but the poorer people in those mid-latitudes who didn't really cause most of this will end up paying the highest price. So the fear is a tipping point. You can have a tipping point for good things where you make a lot of effort to do something and then finally it starts snowballing, but you also can have a tipping point for things starting to get out of control. And that's something that people are afraid of. We don't know exactly when that would occur. There's many possible solutions in addition to just getting rid of CO2. One more radical one is just as it got one of the coldest years ever was in 1944 when we were dropping millions of tons of bombs on our enemies in World War II. The Earth actually chilled down. If you nuked dusty desert areas, that dust could conceivably buy you some time. Yeah, that would dump a lot of radiation out there. But there's a whole list of possible things that we could do to turn them around. Anything that you do to fix anything has a downside. Any shot, you have pain from getting the shot. I have a strange thing. My family, my biggest mentor, my grandfather, Edwin Krieg, who was a much greater engineer than I'll ever be. His big claim to fame was having his technology go into more than half the power plants in the country. He boasted about all the energy that was made in his power plants. And he was also an environmentalist and taught me to love nature. But I recently figured out, well, okay, I guess that was bad, but by making them more efficient, maybe it could have caused less coal to be burnt. But there's not that much you can do about it. I spent a couple hundred hours working on my own idea to turn around global warming involving genetically engineering leaves to try to reflect back more light. When I went through all these calculations and a considerable amount of study, I came to the conclusion that it just wouldn't be able to turn it around. And even if it could, it would take another 30 years to really get good genetic engineering technology to modify plants. And then, of course, you'd have all the unintended consequences. Anytime you make a big change, there's consequences you can't possibly think of. So in any solution, you could have that. Tree planting is a great idea, and that will absorb carbon because extra trees can soak up tons of carbon from the atmosphere. The only possible downside of that is the world is slow to earmark ground for this kind of thing. And also, if it gets real hot, there can be massive fires like we've had all over Colorado and California that would just burn them down again. There's another interesting idea. A few people have experimented with a little bit. If you put iron or kinds of things that make the plankton that grows in the ocean grow better, then that plankton would get eaten by smaller things, fall to the bottom, and put CO2 in the bottom of the ocean. And that's been a way that in the past, when the Earth has been very hot in the past, this mechanism of capturing CO2 by little living things in the ocean, putting it in the bottom of the ocean, then where one plate of the ocean slides under the rest of the plates, it can go deep in the earth and maybe never come out again. So it's hard to know how much this really could affect things. And as the ocean continues to warm up, it's hard to know how that would really react. But there are people doing experiments with that. Many other people think, no, you're playing God to do it. I personally see, I think most people know who this is, Elon Musk. To me, he's kind of a hero. I don't know if he cares about the environment at all, but most of the different stuff he's working on could turn things around. One of the biggest things that slows down solar power from being ubiquitous and making all our energy is the fact you can't store it up at night. Or where we live in Pennsylvania, most days are like today. It wasn't really sunny out. But making solar panels have already gotten about 100 times cheaper in the last 2 decades. But we need people like Elon Musk to continue to bring battery technology cheaper, not just to have cars that don't need to burn oil anymore, but to be able to save it up, because all we'd have to do is have a small percentage of the United States have solar panels on roofs and other surfaces, and we wouldn't need any dirty coal and oil. Because let's face it, a lot of people that sell us our oil are countries that hate us anyhow. So it'd be kind of nice to wean off that for multiple reasons. There are a number of solutions, some pretty radical, some I don't think would work at all, to try to turn things around. Among other ones, we mentioned this one already, where you could fertilize the ocean to get plankton to grow on it and suck up carbon dioxide. There's also things to stop the light from hitting us. If planes could have mixed in with their fuel certain kinds of aerosols that make very tiny particles, if they're particularly reflective, you could stop the heat from ever getting here. Some people are starting to run the math on that, and it might only cost a couple $100 billion a year to do that to cool the earth down. Another approach would be to carefully do cloud seeding, where if you drop the right kind of dust in clouds, you nucleate little particles that cause rain to fall. If you do that where you want it, you could modify weather. Of course, that's also plain God, and it would tend to be that poor countries would tend to get the worst of once people start to do that. A very radical idea would be using giant mirrors in space. It's kind of hard to picture those staying put, but if you could do something like that, that would bounce energy back out into space. So there's also talk about having huge factories that can grab the carbon dioxide out of the air and then pump it safe back down into Earth. Hopefully people wouldn't just dig it up and burn it again. And of course, the most easy natural thing that people are already starting to do is plant more trees. So this is a whole landscape of possible ideas. Now, if things get really, really bad and we cross that tipping point, then there just wouldn't be as much room for 7 billion people to live on the planet. But what's almost worse than that is lots of wonderful species that we'd have on Earth would go away. That's kind of already happening. A lot of coral seas are starting to go. So one of the things we need to do is save up DNA samples of the wonderful diversity of life, of plant, animals, and everything in between, and get that archived. So if we really screw up the planet, maybe another century or two, when people with the technology, we could bring some of this stuff back. Kind of a little bit like Jurassic Park, but I personally would rather bring creatures back that don't eat us. But it would at least be good to save it up so that we could have future generations would have the option to do that. I think just as it was a crime for prehistoric people to get rid of wonderful large creatures that roamed the earth, it would be really bad if we ended up killing every whale and every rainforest creature and that kind of thing. So hopefully people can figure that out. Having come from an evangelical background, I used to, as a kid, love the story of Noah's Ark. But one way to look at that, I can't say I believe it necessarily happened anymore, but maybe what it really is prophecy, not history. Maybe even if we can't keep living samples of everything alive, if we can at least save the DNA of them, and two aren't enough, you really need a breeding population of a lot of samples like that, then it would be possible to protect some of these creatures. Again, we don't know exactly how bad things are going to get, how quick, or if our societies, the sophisticated societies with science like ours, how long they'd necessarily be able to survive as everything starts to go to hell. But the whole question of geoengineering, and this is kind of a symbol for spraying stuff into the atmosphere, it's a controversial one. Many people are afraid to even research it because they think if we have this excuse, oh, we can just do this stuff, put things in the atmosphere to reflect the energy back, then we won't bother getting rid of the source of the problem, which is the extra CO2 in the atmosphere. But I kind of think the stakes are so high, everything should be on the table. There's other really radical ideas for how we could get to a sustainable society. One really weird one is eventually if you could shrink people to be smaller, we'd need less things, we'd need less food, we could fit into smaller area. Some people say we have to reduce our population, not necessarily kill all the people around, but slow our breeding rate, paying people to be sterilized. That's a controversial one. Eventually, we need a way to manufacture food without necessarily growing things on the surface. So there might be an eventual way to make all our food in huge tanks underground using electricity. Of course, there might be a massive effort needed to resettle people. Lots of people who lived in Egypt and Pakistan and countries that are just going to go away, they don't even know that they're kind of in endgame already. It just isn't going to work. I don't know how you'd resettle numbers of people that vast. But the eventual goal of society certainly won't be in any of our lifetimes, is to have a sustainable society where you can just grab stuff from old dumps and not have to keep digging up the earth to get everything. We haven't had that yet. But before we get there, there'll be a massive problem with the sea level rising. With global warming, it's not just about the heat. The sea rises for really 3 different reasons. In some areas like in Louisiana, the ground is settling because it's off the edge of the continental plate, and all the silt washing down that made New Orleans is settling down. All of Pakistan and much of Malaysia and half of Vietnam is like that. Their ground's been sinking for years. In addition to that, all the ice melting is making the ocean level rise, and what's making the ocean level rise faster than the melting of all the ice we used to have that used to reflect heat back into the space is that as it gets warmer, the oceans thermally expand, and that makes the ocean rise even faster. So one of my volunteer efforts as part of being a Boy Scout leader and a science fair promoter is trying to inspire young people to get into science. Among the kinds of things that they could do would be not just nuclear power using uranium, plutonium, which is a little bit messy and not real high energy density, but using solar fusion power, using hydrogen atoms, smacking them together, you get less radiation, more power. It's not possible yet, but that could be a great way to get energy if we can't get it all from solar. There's also has to be invented ways to suck the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and out of the ocean. All the ways I've read about just are not viable. They take way too much energy, too big facilities. It's just not going to happen while I'm still alive. There might be people that have to figure out how to make more tunnels and live in caves. As I've said, we have to save the DNA and ultimately be able to bring back expired species. So we might also be able to use DNA technology to modify species, including ourselves, to be able to survive better in a warming planet. And of course, the big thing is to societally keep individual nations from being selfish and dumping more of this kind of stuff out in the atmosphere. So there's a ton of different areas that almost any area of expertise can be brought into play to try to deal with this kind of problem in the future. And people might recognize this as being one of the biggest, open, most complex kinds of factories that we have. Petroleum distillation and cracking towers. These things are utterly immense. They take a huge amount of energy, but it would probably be something like these things that factories that haven't been designed yet that would have to be much bigger, use far more energy, that could gather the CO2 out of the atmosphere and put it safely down to the ground. That's a job for people that probably aren't born yet. But that concludes actually ahead of time my talk on global warming. I have my email address up here if anyone might want further discussions on this. And I'd also like to give a plug now for this group, phact.org, phact.org. If you like this discussion, I have far better speakers than me on all kinds of fascinating topics about the future, about thinking, about truth, all different new areas of science. We have that on a regular basis. It's a good webpage to take a look at. But let's first go with questions before comments. Are there questions that people had about this so far? Mark, could you unmute microphones here?
People have to do that on their own. There were a couple of comments that came in on the chat. I don't know if you want to address those first.
Yeah, hold on. Deriva pointed out the existence Wikidata and Wiki species. It's something she already looked into me for me, is apparently a great resource of trying to log all that information about different species. There's been a major effort by people in all areas of science to document the incredibly huge amount of information that we have. And it's good to know that people are thinking about this already. I did give a picture up there before in a snowy area that won't be snowy for long. I think it's in Iceland or Greenland, where all kinds of seeds are being saved and DNA samples are being saved. So there are, Deriva gives a good listing of groups that are already involved in this effort. So that's reassuring that there's other people into that. We also got a, Deriva had a question, will there be any downside to large scale seeding of plankton in the oceans? Yeah, well, you pretty much get a knee-jerk reaction from biologists that anything you meddle in, there's always stuff that can happen that you just don't think of. When they brought in one species in Australia to get rid of some kind of insect, then it became overpopulated. Then they brought in another species to get rid of that, and that caused other problems. So the whole ecosystems are really kind of too complicated to figure it all out. My guess would be, sure, yeah, plankton's at the bottom of the food chain, but there are kinds of algae and plankton that I imagine give off poisons, or it could evolve to disrupt things in some way. But some people say, do a local area experiment, see what that does before trying it on the whole ocean. Tom Bolander said, isn't there several 100-year climate cycles? Yes, you're absolutely right. In some of the anti-global warming conservative sites, they aptly point out that the sun has both I think a 16-year and a 32-year cycle where the output of the sun does change. That's only a couple fractions of a percent that the solar luminosity changes as a function of time. There are some orbital changes to the Earth's orbit that occur in time spans way beyond the mere 400 years that we've been tracking things astronomically, and they're thought to possibly have caused some of the cycles of ice ages or getting us out of the ice ages. The biggest thermal cycle that happens with the Earth is there tends to be an ice age about every 100,000 years, and then there's like only a 20,000 year period of time that it tends to get warm. The advantage of the ice ages is they get rid of water, which lowers the sea level, which can make species be able to migrate from one place to another place that otherwise would have been an island. We don't fully know what's all involved in that kind of cycle. And some people have actually said we were about due for another ice age, but this global warming has put it off indefinitely. So yeah, there are a number of cycles, but what we're going through now is clearly caused by humans. The normal background level of CO2 in the atmosphere is around 100 parts per million. It's now up to 4 times that. So pretty much every climatologist out there agrees with the consensus that the really rapid level of heating that we've had has not gone on for a couple million years and is human caused. But just because there's natural cycles out there doesn't mean this isn't a bad thing. Professor David Cattell, who's department chair of the physics department at the Community College of Philadelphia, said that, yeah, the coral reefs are in danger of disappearing very soon. And yeah, he's absolutely right. I don't know how you'd even preserve coral. I hope there's people that know how to do that. It might be that some aquariums can keep the major significant species of the ecosystem of coral intact, even if there's no more in the ocean. I remember hearing about 10, 20 years ago that the white rhino, or maybe the black rhino, the only ones alive really are in zoos. So zoos, unfortunately, might be a way to preserve species. It's best to preserve species in the living state as part of an ecosystem, because just the DNA alone, you don't know if you can bring them back. Mary had a comment about statistical modeling with previous climate cycles, that there's all kinds of mathematical models that have gone on, and within climatologists, there is a debate over which ones are correct. And back when Gore was really pumping up global warming, he predicted things to really cut loose far earlier than it's looking they actually have. So there is fair debate over how things are going to go, and you really need supercomputers to do this. You need really powerful calculations that map the entire planet and all the movement of heat and moisture around. And it's a difficult thing to do. Mary also confirms that the die-off of coral reefs is related to increases in water temperature. In some places on Earth, the temperature is actually going down, and other places going up. Of people that have tried to distract from global warming, they'll cherry pick and point out one area in the planet where it's getting colder, but ignore the vast areas that it's getting hotter. And one thing that actually could happen is, as the ocean heats up, the whole Gulf Stream that brings warm water from the Caribbean up towards Europe. Europe is way north of us. That actually could break down, which might make it get colder over there. But it would be getting way, way hotter in the more populated areas of the ocean. So there's all kinds of problems occurring at rates that are hard to predict going on all over the Earth. Are there any other questions or statements to
Eric,
comment
I
on?
have a bit of a comment here. It's Bill Lambert, right above you on the screen.
Yep.
Mark knows this because he knew my late wife and I well. We're big train buffs, and trains happen to be the second most efficient transportation overland that there is. The only one that outshines trains is barges, and you can't take a barge from here to New York or from here to Philadelphia. But follow my logic here. If we had a high-speed rail network, and there are people that are toying with this, a high-speed rail network such as exists in Europe, and they've proven over there that pollution has been dropping drastically because of high-speed rail. And if we plant trees and prevent developers in particular from taking trees down and not replacing them, we could get rid of a lot of the higher altitude aircraft that I swear are putting the carbon outputs away from the atmosphere where they can't be mitigated, away from the Earth's locale where they can't be mitigated by trees or by any other source. The pollutants are up at a higher altitude. Trains have one capability that planes will never have. Trains can be fueled by almost any type of fossil burning fuel, by electric, by even nuclear power. There's experimenting now with liquid petroleum or liquid LPG, liquid petroleum gases, to operate trains to make them more efficient. But if we had a high-speed rail network like this, we could get rid of a lot of the planes that are flying at higher altitudes. And with the planting of more trees is solving the problems of absorbing the carbon and mitigating the situation too. Now, Amtrak is announcing, and it will be a general statement and a general reveal in the not too distant future, a quote, high-speed version of the Acela. The Acela was okay, but it's outmoded. This new higher speed version will, again, like the Acela, will only be available on the Northeast Corridor, which means between Boston and Washington. But this is going to do a fantastic 145-mile-an-hour speed.
Oh, I agree
That's
with
slow poke. That's a slow poke. You take Europe, they got them that are doing 100
yeah, over
miles
200.
an hour more. And they're eliminating a lot of aircraft traffic over Europe because of this. And what I was saying about developers and about cities, Westchester, for example, has a policy in place where if you take down a tree, you have to plant 2.
That's a great idea. A couple comments on your train ideas. You're absolutely right. On land, that's the most efficient way to move things. Once electric cars come, then it's possible that regular cars won't be as polluting. Americans, you probably realize, are lazy and impatient, and they're not like the Europeaners wanting to sit shoulder to shoulder with other people in trains, even though they're vastly more efficient to move people. But there's another generation of trains that could be pretty exciting if we get underground tubes, possibly hollowed out and vacuumized. Then you could have Mach speed trains doing intercontinental pulls, going from one side of the country to another at faster than plane speeds. And you're absolutely right. Planes are dangerous. They're very expensive. They take a long time. They have safety issues. They leave pollution high up in the atmosphere. But it's possible Elon Musk's or other people's tunnel technology might be even better yet to put the trains underground. The only reason New York City supports all those people is the subway system.
I've studied that a bit, and the one thing that bothers me about it is, first of all, is routing of these tunnels. It's going to be very difficult when you get to the Rocky Mountains, the same way we had the problems with the existing rails through the Rockies. Secondly is, I can't see any practical way of doing this with any high capacity of passenger occupancy. Trains generally are not as crowded, nearly as crowded as aircraft, particularly long distance trains, because in coach, they have to have room for the seats to recline so that coach passengers can have a sleeping area at night. So they don't have near the sardine in a can type of situation that you do with aircraft.
Yeah.
The thing of it is this, as I say, with the vacuum tube and the whole thing, that's a neat concept, but I can't see it taking, let's say, pardon me, let's say 120, 130 people in a line with this type of technology. You can do that with a train very easily. The thing of it is, we've neglected the rails ever since World War II in this country, or we could be ahead of where Europe is right now, and Japan, and China. All these countries have genuine high-speed rail transit, and they have drastically cut back pollution and oil consumption and the air traffic that we have.
We're kind of spoiled here to like being in our own cars. I'm not defending it. I'm just saying that's how people think it would be better to have more efficient transportation and the energy released by transportation could go down a lot. The big boats that you referred to, by the way, use bunker fuel, which is horribly polluting. That's something that there's probably a way to improve that too. The Swiss have drilled like 40-mile tunnels through the Alps. It's possible with new drilling technology.
Sure.
We could run stuff deep underground.
Mm-hmm. Sure. But what you were saying about the American public, this is entirely true. And the COVID virus is proving this. Look at the transportation that we've had just over the weekend with, again, millions of people traveling over the weekend for visits. And sure as hell, we're going to see a tremendous spike in COVID cases again because of it. And it's a kind of thing that unless we have a gun to our head in this country, we will not solve some of these problems. It takes that kind of impetus to get us to move off of dead center and off of where we are. We
Well,
can't do what we did back in World War II with this COVID crisis. We don't have that kind of will.
Yes, World War II was a time where the greatest generation had to resolve. They increased the output of the United States while beating two of the worst behaved groups of people on the planet. Everyone pulled together. We haven't had a time like that. An outgrowth of that brought us all kinds of new technology. We hopefully have some new technology like what we're doing right now with COVID, but science will solve the COVID problem, and hopefully a lot of science will come in for this too. Tom Bolander brought out that Neil deGrasse Tyson promoted scrubbing carbon out of the atmosphere using a chemical system. There's some rocks that will absorb carbon, and that's something I haven't studied the details. I'm not a chemist of that, but at some point there's a cost to grind up rock to get the CO2 to combine with it, and then you have to put that stuff somewhere. Better minds than mine would have to look at what's the cost, what's the scope of that, what are the secondary effects. It's one of many possible ways on the table to scrub out the carbon in the atmosphere. And CO2 is very expanded stuff. It's hard to get things to react with it. It would be expensive to chill the air to liquid state to get it out that way. I'm just assuming people in the future will figure out ways to do that. We need a lot more energy, excess energy to do that. What Bill said about Americans being spoiled certainly does come to mind. We use far more resources than anyone else does. We have bigger cars, more clothes, bigger houses, and all that stuff makes a strain on the environment. And the truth is, a lot of people in other countries do laugh at us for not being very green and being impatient and not traveling in groups organized on trains like other people do. I don't know answers for social problems like that. Do we have other ideas and comments from people on? Well, if we
I was
have,
going to I mentioned a couple of things in the comments. One, there's a really neat book that was written several years ago called Physics for Future Presidents by a physics professor at Stanford. And it was basically a rundown of the physics he wanted his president to understand. But he spent a great deal of time going through risk reward of nuclear power. And it comes out very, very positive. And, you know, he's got all the math to prove it.
Yeah.
You know, if we start burying nuclear fuel in that the place out in Colorado,
Yucca Mountain,
Wyoming, or wherever, the odds that it'll ever cause a problem are really, really low.
Oh,
Much lower than the problem caused by burning coal. And I've seen coal burned in power plants. There's a place down in North Carolina. They may not be burning coal anymore, but they were about 2,000 megawatts of electricity, consuming 200 carloads of coal every day.
oh yeah.
And coal dust everywhere in that place. Not a place you wanted to be. But the other thing is, I hope everybody here has seen the Nova special on decoding the weather. It's 2 hours and it goes through the whole thing from the first time anybody ever measured the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere up at the top of Mauna Loa and down to measure area, figuring out that the carbon that's in the carbon dioxide is up there is old, not young, and therefore from carbon dating, and therefore it came from digging up fossil fuels, which have been around underground for hundreds of thousands of years. But the neatest concept he brought up was he started measuring the amount of carbon coming out of the exhaust pipe of your car. And I don't know whether anybody would object to it, but what he called it right there on Nova was car turds. And he started measuring how much there was. And then he put a little graphic up that was overlaid on Los Angeles of the amount of carbon dioxide a car would produce in 1 year, and it was a big pile of car turds.
Well, it's huge, but it's invisible. You don't see it. You don't think about it. What you said, Ron, about nukes is a good point. It just so happens that the waste problem is a political problem. It really isn't a real problem.
No.
And the coal that you were talking about, it's thought that something like 1 million people a year just die of particulate matter that comes from burning coal. So that 1 million people a year guaranteed. I think there were 5 people that died when TMI happened. I grew up near there. There's the people driving their car at 100 miles an hour to get away from it when it blew up. Nuclear power is thought the radiation released to maybe kill 100 or so people a year, but yeah, it just would be way safer. It's a shame we missed that opportunity. Some people are trying to revive new inherently safe fission nuclear power plants. My whole life, they've been promising in 20 years we'll have fusion power. They say it's close now. I don't know, but in the meantime, in the last 20 years, the cost of getting energy from solar panels has come down 100-fold, and wind power is really starting to take off too.
Oh, you reminded me of one thing that I saw many years ago. You were talking about, the fact that we're cloudy all the time, there isn't much energy. Well, that isn't quite true. Some years ago, when the building down in King of Prussia was GE Space, they put not exactly a solar panel up on the roof, but one of these things that had black hoses, and they pumped water up there.
Yes,
when they
that works all the time.
Yeah, when they opened it up the first time, we all could go up there and watch. And I took a look at the meters. They had a flow meter on the water going in and temperature going in and going out. And it happened to be a cloudy, cool day. But I wrote down the numbers and went back in my office and calculated how many BTUs they were getting out of that thing. And it was immense on a cloudy day.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I've missed the solar panel, heat solar panels. You can heat whole houses with them. You don't even need the electricity. Or there's other solar panels that they do solar voltaics on the surface, make electricity with that, and then the waste heat they use to heat buildings or preheat things for industrial applications.
Now, they were using it. If you've seen that building, there's a big glass thing that's a couple of stories high out in the front of it. It's the cafeteria, and they were heating the cafeteria with that heat.
Yeah.
Even on a cold day with no sun.
Well, any house can be made with chrome walls and the right kind of glazing and ways to save heat and not need much more than body heat and the sun to keep it going. There's a comment from Deriva, something that's exciting to me, that there are people working on DNA modification to make meat. So people that have ethical problems with eating animals, you could make meat that way. Right now, actually, a big greenhouse gas contributor is having all these cows out that when they fart, it's methane gas, which is 20 times more energy reflective than CO2, even though it does get scrubbed from the atmosphere sooner. And when all that stuff decays, it makes even more methane gas. So if we could synthesize meat in large tanks, you wouldn't have a 2-ton critter out there trampling ground to just try to get 200 or 300 pounds of meat. So that's another thing that could turn things around. And for that matter, farming could be made sustainable. There should be new ways to do more with less. If we don't do it, there'll be mass die-offs that we haven't seen since biblical times. We're getting low on time. Any other comments, questions? And then we can end up without taking a whole hour. Okay, Mark, I guess we've gone on long enough. I don't want to bore people too much. There's a saying you should quit while you're ahead.
Oh,
This has
Eric,
been a good discussion. Yeah.
there's actually more methane coming from cows when they belch.
Yes. Oh, cows from the belch, not when they
Yes.
fart. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, yeah, because they're ruminants. They're four-chambered stomachs. So
right.
that's where most of it comes from. And the oil industry is kind of sloppy about just letting a lot of it outgas. They don't always even flame it off. There's other forms of methane that are kind of scary as the tundra starts to thaw in Russia. That could release huge amounts of this. And as areas rot, as forests rot and die off, that releases a lot. There's all kinds of things that people are studying, and people have measured ant farts, how much methane termites produce. That's another thing that's a lot, but we're getting more and more information and all this from all kinds of sources. But I could go on forever. Should we shut on down, Mark, after thanking you for putting on these wonderful talks?
You're welcome. And thank you for this discussion. It's been really good. Anyone else have any final comments before we close here? All right.
Okay, well, thank you,
Great.
everybody, for showing me up and hearing me out and adding good ideas of your own on this, and we'll keep hoping.
Be continued, I'm
science to
sure.
solve more
Yeah.
problems.
Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks, Eric.
Thank
Glad
you
to be
now.
part of it. Take care, all. Be safe. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye, Eric.
Thank you so much, Eric.
So long,
Thank you,
Tom and David and
Yeah.
Ronald and
Very good.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Eric. Good night, everybody.
Very much.
bye.
Good night.